Hello and welcome everybody to my talk about making non-game software with Godot. My name is Ben, although some of you may know me better as Nyamster online. And if you look closely at this slide, you might be able to figure out why I'm called that way. So yes, Godot, first and foremost, is a game engine, as the subtitle implies. But part of that is a very capable UI engine as well. And part of the reason why that is because the Godot editor, as many of you may know, is in fact a project done in Godot as well. Now, obviously, this is not quite what I'll be talking about here today, because Godot is actually written in C++, and so is its editor. And when I'm talking about making software in Godot, then I actually mean, of course, using that editor, using GDScript as a nice scripting language to iterate quickly. But there's other examples for software made with Godot already. Probably the most popular one is this one called Pixelorama. It's a pixel art tool with about 7K stars on GitHub. Then we have this one, which is an infinite canvas note-taking app, also fairly popular. We have tools to paint textures on 3D models, Material Maker. There is stuff to do scalable vector graphics, GodotSVG. And recently we got this remake of a classic music making app, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because it's Irish and I will butcher that. And those are just the main ones, the popular ones that you may have heard before, that you have encountered somewhere. But obviously, if you look further, you will find other smaller projects made in Godot. And one of those is this one called Habituary. And if you look down here, you might spot a familiar name. Yes, that's my name. So this is my project and the reason why I'm standing here in front of you talking to you about all of this. So Habituary is a desktop app for making to-dos and managing to-dos. And if you now go, oh, I am not interested in that at all, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to be. The rest of the talk won't cover any of that. This just motivates my experience. So this is completely done in Godot. And I have been working on this for like 3 months now. So I have some experience in this regard that I want to share with you. This is still a work in progress, so if you want to try it out and feel brave about that, then you can under this link. And if you're not quick enough or can't see it properly, then wait for the final slide. There will be a QR code for you to scan there as well. So yes, we can see that Godot is a powerful UI engine, in fact. And there are already people that are making software with it. So it's not just something theoretical that I'm preaching here. You can actually do that. And so everything seems fine up until this point, but obviously there's also some cons why maybe you shouldn't do that. So let's talk about reasons not to use Godot for making software. So one fairly well-known fact is that there is no screen reader support as of now for Godot. This is true both for apps as well as games, and it basically means that if your users are blind or vision impaired, then they won't be able to use a screen reader to interface with your app because the app is not providing any information for the screen reader to use. This is a known issue. It's about 2 years old. You can find it under this issue number. Currently, there is no solution for that, so if you're using Godot and care about that, you're out of luck for now. In a similar fashion, there is no deep system integration, which actually makes sense if you think about Godot being a game engine first and foremost. So with games, you want them to appear and behave pretty similar or exactly the same way across all platforms. So if I play my game on the Mac, then it should look the same and behave the same as on Windows, of course. But with software, this is generally not true because you want software to blend in and fit into the rest of the system. And this is, generally speaking, an area where Godot lacks a bit. It's getting better, but one popular example would, for example, be the system tray support. So if you have an app and you want to have an icon in the system tray, until recently you couldn't do that at all with Godot. And now I think there is a commit somewhat recently which allows you to do that under Windows and Mac. I haven't tested that, but it doesn't work under Linux still. So if you want to do that, you're out of luck. And there's more such issues. But I think the biggest problem actually is that it's not yet battle-proven. What do I mean by this? It means that there's not enough people doing those things in the UI world currently. And that's a problem, obviously, because if not enough people doing something on a high enough level, then there will be some issues which slips through the cracks because nobody noticed them and raises any concerns. But it is possible that you look at this list and say, okay, I don't mind any of that, that works for me. And in that case, there's obviously also good reasons to use Godot for this. The first one, pretty obvious, it's open source. So any of the things that I just mentioned, you could, in theory, fix yourself if you want to. Also, there's the point that it runs on every major platform. So if you want to bring it to Windows, Linux, Mac, Android, iPhone, or even the web, Godot can do that for you, all from the same build, and just at a click of a button. So exporting projects in general is not that hard, and that's a major advantage for using Godot in this area. Also, you can use really advanced visual effects with Godot, obviously, because it's a game engine, which is a lot harder in traditional UI engines. And if you want a good example for that, you can watch yesterday's lightning talk, where such a project was mentioned, making use of custom 3D options. But for me, and probably also for most of you here in this room, the biggest advantage of using Godot is that I'm already familiar with it. So I have been using Godot since 2017 pretty actively. So I know how to do things, how to move around. I don't have to learn a new framework or anything. I just could start right away. And even better so, everything I learned on my journey doing this app, I can now reapply for my game dev endeavors as well. So that's pretty neat. Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you that making this is actually still a good idea, despite some shortcomings. So where do we now start when we make an app in Godot? Well, obviously we have to create a new project, and then you will be tasked with choosing a renderer. And you might be inclined to choose the compatibility renderer, simply because it's the least advanced 3D graphics, and it runs on low-end and older devices, which is, generally speaking, what you want. From software, it should reach as many people as it can, and it should not be that demanding. But I would actually argue you should use the mobile renderer. And why that is, I will come to in a second. But first, let's address the elephant in the room, which is some of you might still think a game engine for making software is a bit overkill. And so let's talk about that, because you're not quite wrong. What actually happens in a game is we run at a stable frame rate, redrawing the same frame, not the same frames many times per second, to create the illusion of a fluent motion, like in this case with a bouncing ball. And that makes generally sense as long as there is actually change. But in that case, for example, where we have a static button sitting idly in the corner of the screen, that just wastes CPU cycles. Nothing is changing, so that's not a good idea, obviously. But I wouldn't bring this up if there wasn't an easy solution to all of this, and so let me introduce low processor mode. Low processor mode is an advanced project setting, so make sure you toggle this on up there in the right corner so you can actually see the setting. Then go to application and run, and toggle low processor mode on. By default, it will be off. Now, what does low processor mode do? Basically, it means that Godot will only redraw the screen if there's actually a change. So not 60 frames per second, but only a couple of times when there's actually something changing, and it makes sense. At the cost of a slightly slower redrawing time, but in general, that's a worthy trade-off for making apps. So I would recommend you to turn this on always. Be careful though, if you're now smart about this and feel like, okay, now I can check the FPS and they should be fairly low because there's not much changing. This is not true, surprisingly enough. If you check the get frames per second method in the engine singleton, or you look at the profiler and at the graphs there, you will notice that the FPS is actually fairly stable and high. And that apparently is because Godot is not technically dropping frames, it's just deciding not to render them. So if you actually want to see if this works, you have to check your task manager and look for the CPU load of your app. And that will be, of course, more notable on lower-end hardware because there it's more demanding to run anything. Or you could use the getFramesDrawn method in the engine singleton. The problem here is you have to be careful that you don't actually render it on screen, like in a label or on a button, because if you do that, then you're redrawing the screen again, and this doesn't work. So maybe print it and look at what's actually printed there, just to convince you that it works. Speaking of redrawing, let's get back to why I actually said I would recommend you use the mobile render, at least for now. And the reason for that is actually fairly simple. It's this setting here in the debug menu, debug canvas item redraws. By default, it's off. I ignored that for a very long time, and it's actually wrong. Don't do that. This setting doesn't work in compatibility mode. So if you want to use it, you have to use the mobile renderer for now. And what it does, you can see here on my app Habituary. It will flash things, UI elements that are currently redrawn in red, and then it slowly fades out. So you get a clear impression of what's redrawn when. So this is the state when I just boot up the app, but then if I just update one label, only that label would flash red. So it's super useful to get a good impression of what's changing, actually. OK, so far so boring. Those were the basics. What now? Lots and lots of control nodes. If you want to make an app in Godot, you're using control nodes. And there's pretty much control nodes for everything that you want to do. So there's containers to rearrange other control nodes in certain patterns. We have buttons, sliders, labels, panels, tabs, scroll bars, drop-down menus, text edits, graphs, everything you could wish for. It's available right there, and it has a common base, namely the control node. That has certain advantages because some things are a lot easier to do in Godot than they have any right to be. For example, you might think about responsive UI. So generally speaking, if your window gets bigger, then the content should adapt to that. If it gets smaller, the content should adapt to that as well. Now, in web devs, that can be quite hard sometimes, but in Godot, it's super easy. Actually, what you have to do is just make sure that the stretch mode is set to disabled in the project setting, which it happens to be by default. So you don't have to do anything. And what this does is basically treats the window as its own canvas. It has no fixed resolution. It just scales to the window size. And because control nodes are anchored to a certain point, it just works. So if you say a control node is anchored to the left side, it will always stay on the left side, no matter how big or small the window is. And same for the right side or the upper side or whatever. And you can also make it fill the whole rect, however big or small that might be. So the only thing you generally want to take care of here is maybe to set a minimum size, which fortunately is very easy as well. You just get the windows that you're currently using. In Godot 4.3, you can use multiple windows if you want to. And then you set its min size property to a vector 2 of integers. The first vector property is the width, and the other one is the height of the window. And yeah, that's it. Then Godot shouldn't go below that value, and you prevent users from resizing the window to 1 pixel times 1 pixel and complaining that they can't read any text anymore, which is kind of cool. Another thing that's quite easy in Godot is actually drag and drop. It's so easy, actually, that it only involves 3 methods that every control node supports. So you just have to override them to enable that behavior. If you want something to drag around, then you implement the getDragData method. So you basically return a variant, which can be anything, any complex scene or simple scene of the data that you want to drag around. So if you have, let's say, a label and you want to drag it around, then you return the label itself from that method. And then you can drag it around with a mouse. But now you have to define also where you want to drop it. So for every area where you want to actually be able to drop something, you implement the canDropData function, which has to return true whenever you want to drop something there. So quite simple as well. And in the case that canDropData returns true, Godot will automatically call dropData, which again you can override to decide what should happen in that case. So maybe you want to reparent some nodes, let's say the drag data that you get here, and voila, you're done. That is all you have to know about drag and drop. There's some nuances to it, like there's some signals that you can call and stuff, but in general, this is the gist of it. This is what you have to know, and it's super easy and straightforward. OK, so prototyping in Godot is extremely fast. You might know that from games, and it's also true for UI. You can actually do that so fast if you're used to it, like me, that you might decide to ditch the whole mock-up phase of using something like Figma and do it directly in Godot. Obviously, that takes a little bit longer than just drawing a few rectangles, but then you have something usable already, which is quite cool. Also, control nodes abstract a lot of complexity away, which is quite useful as well. In general, you don't have to worry about many things that you would have to do otherwise. But, as always, the devil is in the details here, so let's talk about some negatives again. Exhibit 1, the check button. So if you don't know what a check button is, it's this one. So you basically have an on-off switch, and you have a text accompanying it to the left side. And if you click either on the text or the button, then it will toggle that button. So far, so good. Godot supports that. You can just use a check button wherever you want. But what if you want to flip it around? So the button on the left and the text on the right. Should be easy, right? Unfortunately, it's not easy because it's not supported. You cannot do this. So what you have to do instead, if you want to get this, is you have to set up an HBox container, then add a check button without a text, then manually add a label next to it, then add a script and track the mouse inputs to actually toggle the button. So you can work around this, but it's a bit cumbersome, and in general, it shouldn't be necessary. And this is no exception. It happens quite often that a control node is fairly limited in one regard, and usually that regard tends to be the one where the Godot engine is not making any use of it. So if Godot always has this button on the right, then the control node will only support that, and probably nobody thought about the other use cases, which is quite annoying sometimes. Exhibit number 2, tooltips. So again, fairly normal stuff. Every app has tooltips, so you can hover over any element in the app and see what it does actually, maybe even a shortcut. And Godot is no exception here. Of course, Godot can do this because the editor can do this. Every control node has a tooltip field in the inspector where you can just insert some text. And if the control node also has a shortcut associated with this, for example, with a button, then you can automatically include that shortcut in the tooltip as well. Godot will do that by default. But what if you want to have a fancy tooltip that doesn't look gray like the regular tooltips? That's also surprisingly easy because there's a make custom tooltip function, which you can just call and provide any scene you want to use for the tooltip. So in theory, you can use the texture of a pink elephant as your tooltip if you want to. There's no rule against that. You can animate that, all fine. However, there's one thing that you cannot do, and that thing is actually quite simple. You cannot decide where the tooltip should go. You cannot position it in space. That is Godot's job. Godot will decide for you where the tooltip goes. And obviously, in an app, that can go wrong sometimes, and it looks ugly, and you don't want to do that. So one of the first things that I did when I write my app is that I made a custom tooltip class, which enables me to do exactly that. And obviously, I have to reinvent the wheel here. I basically cloned the whole tooltip thing just to add this one little thing that I wanted, which, again, is a bit annoying. And then we come to exhibit number 3, the scroll container. So again, scroll containers are quite simply containers which add a scroll bar automatically if the content of the container is bigger than the container itself. So if I have a long list of items and I put them in a scroll container, I get a scroll bar. All fine, that works well. However, for my app, I wanted to have a scroll container for every day in the week, and it looked kind of ugly having 7 scroll bars in one view. So I decided to go with something slightly different, which looks like this. If there's actually something to scroll, it will add these buttons at the top and bottom of the list, and you can click on these buttons to scroll the list. So instead of using the scroll bar, you can either click on that or you can drag and drop. And they also give you how many items there are above or below, which is quite useful information in my class as well. Now, the problem with this is it's, again, not easy. Why is it not easy? Because the scroll container does not give you any indication that it's scrolling. So there is no scroll signal or anything. So what you have to do, actually, to get this to work is you have to reinvent the wheel again. So I coded a bunch of input handling, which is exactly what the C++ code is doing, just to get the according inputs and then accept these events, so Godot doesn't handle them itself, and then I emit a scroll signal. So again, I can work around that, but it's a bit annoying that I have to do that in the first place, and that could easily be fixed on the C++ side. However, all of this is no biggie, right? Again, this whole thing is not battle-proven, so it's expected that stuff like this happens. People haven't done this extensively, so you will encounter stuff like this. And all of this might get fixed eventually, right? It's an open source project, and if I open an issue and complain about it, maybe something will get fixed. And I should also say that I could work around any of those, right? So even though it annoyed me, I could write pure GD code that solved all these issues for me. I didn't have to write any C++, which is quite nice still. So all in all, I would do it again. I would recommend you to try this out if you're already familiar with Godot, because GD is nice. It's super fast to iterate. So let's get to the takeaways. What should you take home from this talk, hopefully? First, I would recommend you, again, to use the mobile renderer. Why would I do that? Because I think it's worse for the debugging interface for the redraws, so you can easily spot when Godot is redrawing which parts of your app, which basically costs you CPU. In the same fashion, I would recommend you enable the low processor mode, which saves, again, CPU, because you're not redrawing the screen all the time, 60 frames per second. And if you do those things, then with a little bit of training, you will enjoy super rapid prototyping using Godot's control nodes. It's quite nice to use. I still stand by that. But in the end, you will still despair at the details. That is just how it is, right? If you're doing any software, no matter what you're doing it with, in the end, you will run into some problems that are complex and cumbersome to fix. Still, I would recommend you're giving Godot a try for this. And that brings me to the end of my talk. If you want to follow my project, you can do so under the following link. If you like what you see, please leave a like. And if you like me so much that you want to have more of me, then you can follow me on Mastodon, where I'm also quite active. And with that said, I would say thank you for your attention. And I think we have 2 or 3 minutes for questions.
Thank you for the talk. I have the question, if you were a web developer before, or if you tried the web platform, because I kind of disagree with the responsive design point you mentioned. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, sure. I'm not a web developer. I dabbled a little bit in web development, but it's not my profession or anything. So it's quite possible that there are some frameworks which makes that really easy. That's not my point. My point is that it's in Godot extremely easy as well.
Did you do it deploy onto mobile apps? And
so far I haven't,
yeah,
but it would be possible.
because you have all this sort of issue of sleep modes and the thing deciding to go into hibernation when you don't want it to. And
yeah, that's still a bit of an ongoing issue, but it's getting better in Godot.
Hey, so about the architecture side of things, because in typical programming, in typical programs, object-oriented design is, the go-to nowadays. But a lot of talks yesterday and today were going on about breaking that for game design, for going for global state, for hacking it a bit, to make it less beautiful but more easy to iterate. I'm not sure if I'm tempted to do that in doing a real application, or if it's a really bad idea. So my question basically is it a good idea to break from the conventions, to just use Godot's built-in stuff better, or keep it nice and tidy?
Well, it always depends on what you want to do, and if it works for you, then I would say go for it. Personally, I try to stay away from this as much as I can, because in the long run, it probably comes back to hurt me. But sometimes it's just the easiest way to fix a problem, to get a little bit dirty and hacky, and then I've done it in that project as well. So yeah, it depends, I would say.